a conductive wire, and you were so electric. I had no say when you came so near and just passed right through me.
Hey everyone, welcome to Geekdom is Back, as is Tim Matthews. Today we're talking all about Mandy, which is kind of a hard film to put into one genre, but we're celebrating it for Horror Month this October. Tim, you and I both hadn't seen this, so was this something that was already on your watch list?
Definitely. It's been on my watch list for a really long time. And I've managed to not look into anything about it. You know, I'd only seen certain screenshots, of Nicolas Cage looking crazy or something like that.
Yeah.
Or something showcasing the vibrant colors in it. But I had no context. I never read a synopsis to it. I never really looked at the cast. I wanted to keep it fresh just because the way people would talk about it gave it this feeling of like, go into this as fresh as possible. And I'm very, very glad I did.
Yeah, I had watched one of the trailers just before diving into the movie, but prior to that, I hadn't seen any of the trailers. I, like you, saw the screenshots of Nicolas Cage just looking crazy. And once you dive into it, you really get a different tone at the start of the movie because there aren't any words being spoken for like the first 6 or 7 minutes, I think.
Yeah.
And you just get a look at Nicolas Cage's character Red and his everyday life. You know, he's basically a lumberjack, I guess. And you see him cutting down a tree, and then he gets on a helicopter and someone offers a beer. He doesn't want one. And you don't have any dialogue until he gets back to his cabin deeper into the woods, which was a pretty cool cabin, I might add. The setting for this was just so great. And I think what this movie did was, based on the promotional material I saw, I thought it was just going to be like a bloodbath the entire time. And it doesn't do that. You really get this full picture of who this character is before and after this significant event happens. And that event doesn't happen until the halfway point in the movie, when they have already taken Mandy. And obviously, spoilers for anyone listening to this. I know this is a somewhat more recent movie, but it still came out last year, so you've had plenty of time to watch it.
Yeah.
But this cult takes Mandy, and then they just end up burning her in front of Red. And that's what sets him off. But even right after that moment, it still takes a little while to get into those big action scenes.
Yeah, this movie, I was the same way. I kind of, some of the ways that people who have seen it have kind of described this, because, it was, at the height of people getting excited about like the next John Wick and everything. And so like just these types of movies where I felt like after John Wick, some other actors started getting movies where people's first description would be, oh, this is, Nicolas Cage's John Wick. Oh, this is Charlize Theron's John Wick for like Atomic Blonde. Like that was the description I would get. And I actually think that description very much works for this movie. But like what takes it a step further is that when you tell me, oh, it's somebody's John Wick, like you said, I'm thinking, oh, this is just going to be like
nonstop action.
Yeah. Just like, destroying people like through the whole thing and everything. But the fact is, this is kind of his like John Wick in that it heightens all around everything that we kind of love about Nicolas Cage, like that weird, crazy part of Nicolas Cage. And it hones in on all of that by giving us this very subdued, atmospheric film for like 80% of it. And then even after something horrific happens, it's still very subdued. They just build the atmosphere with the colors, and that score is so cool in this movie. And then there's a turn when he goes to visit that guy to pick up what he calls the Reaper, which we heard that term from Mandy a little bit earlier.
Yeah.
When she said, "I see the Reaper coming for you," or something like that. And when there's that turn, I'm like, okay, this is where the movie shifts to the tone that everyone's kind of been like hinting at. And I got like really excited, and then it still took its time, but it did it in such a good way. Like I'm still, I finished, I mentioned to you before we started recording, like I finished watching this like 15 minutes before we started. So I'm still like processing some things.
You're processing it live on the podcast right now, but
Yeah.
I watched it last night, so I've had a little time to sleep on it. And, you know, I was kind of at first playing games on my phone while I was watching it because it did start off a little slower, but not slow in the sense to where it was boring necessarily. I just have a habit of multitasking while I'm watching things. And eventually I was like, okay, this is getting really interesting. So I would set my phone down and just pay attention to the movie. And even though it's 2 hours long, the pacing of it never felt like it was 2 hours, because even at the beginning when you were going through this sort of more atmospheric setting and everything like you mentioned, it was still interesting just because of the way this film was made. You know, the pacing was good, but also you just really got this sense of, okay, these two characters are out here. They want to be by themselves, really, because you don't live in a cabin in the woods if you want to be surrounded by people all the time. And you can tell Red isn't really huge on his job. It seems like Mandy is the more artistic type.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you stuck around after the credits or not, but there was a little shot of just like artwork and sketches on a desk. And I believe that was the desk she was sitting at when Red came home from work that night. And so that was just like a nice little thing to get a picture of at the end. It wasn't even really a scene. It was just like this still, really, at the end of the credits. Yeah. And so you have it starting that way. And then they introduce the cult leader, Jeremiah Sand. And that's when things start getting a little more interesting, but also a lot weirder. And you're like, oh, yeah, okay, something strange is going on here. And anytime you have a cult involved, things are going to get weird. I've noticed that with the various shows that I have watched that have either been about true stories that involve cults or just the depiction of cults in fiction, which they all seem pretty similar.
Yeah.
Real or fake.
Yeah. Even the way that like the Jeremiah scene started, like it confused me at first because like it had her walking past like the bus, and then it did this like freeze frame, and it was just all in red, and then it cut to like a title screen. That was almost like the title of a chapter. And so I got like confused, and I'm just like, oh wait, I'm like, is this movie? I was like, I didn't think this was like an anthology or anything like that. And then I started seeing the through lines, and I'm like, man, like what is this? Every little thing that this movie added, it just kept me guessing, because I was like, where is this movie gonna go? Like, what are they gonna do with this? Because you've got these dreamlike sequences, you've got bits of animation, thrown in there, and then these hyper intensive colors, and just like long shots and the way it builds. So I'm right there with you. Like that the movie up to that point was kind of like, this is really pretty to look at, and I'm not sure where this is going, but I'm kind of enjoying my time with these characters. But then it's like, there's that moment where I'm like, all right, like this is something's happening. Like this is something I really, really need to focus on.
Yeah, that's what I mean too when I said I had to put my phone down, because I was like, oh, okay, now is where they really want you to pay attention. And it's not that they didn't want you to pay attention before. It was just that they were setting the scene for the relationship that Red and Mandy have. Yeah. And I really do want to talk about the cinematography for this too, because one, the lighting was just all these tones of red in so many shots, and it was so dark at the same time. I had a light on behind me, and I was like, okay, I have to go turn these lights off, because I can't see the screen as good as I want to for the tone that they were setting. And then just the framing of the shots too, when you have Red, tied up in the barbed wire and he's just watching Mandy burn and the car headlights are on him after the fact.
Yeah.
It's just like, wow, okay. They really understood what feel they were going for with this and how they wanted to frame a lot of these shots. And then you get a shot of him after he gets out of the barbed wire and everything. And he's in this insanely colorful, patterned bathroom,
Yeah.
And I was just like, oh, wow, that is so very 70s. And obviously this took place in the 80s, but it was like, okay, you're still going to have some styles from the 70s rolling over into the 80s. It's not like as soon as a new decade hits, everyone goes out and changes their decor.
Yeah.
So you just really get a sense for how these characters lived, and Jeremiah comes and just turns everything upside down on them and takes away the one thing that Red cares about the most. And then that's when you get into the action scenes, and the way those were shot too was just so fantastic when he's, there with the crossbow, I believe it is, and he's just looking through the sight trying to get these crazy biker gang people who aren't really people.
Yeah.
The character designs for those, because it was so dark, they were a little muddied, but at the same time it was still really effective, because it's like,
oh yeah,
you didn't need to see how truly terrifying they were just to know that they weren't normal.
Yeah. This whole movie was like, it was right down to, the t-shirts they wear and everything, and the character designs and the way the music goes. This movie it's metal. Like this movie is as metal as can be, and those character designs, like while it like you said, like while it was dark and it was muddied, like when the light would change in just a way to frame them in that shot, like their character design would just pop. And I'm just sitting there and I'm like, this is terrifying, and this is also cool. Like these characters look cool. And then it's the initial attack, like when they capture them, the way that they used like electrical lighting and flickering, and so like you could only see exactly what they wanted you to see. That was a really, really intense sequence.
Yeah. There were a lot of intense moments as soon as the abduction happened, basically. And that's when I was just like, all right, putting everything aside, watching this, and it was so wild. And, I think it might have been a little too weird for me at times. I think story-wise, it was a good story, but then I almost wish they would have been able to dive into the cult a little more, because things felt very weird with that. He was like, I need this girl. And you had the girl who obviously wasn't super into being in the cult, but it seemed like she was someone's daughter, maybe even Jeremiah's daughter. And Red lets her go, but you never really get a sense of what was going on in the cult that made her stay. And I don't know, it just felt like they could have spent maybe a little more time on the cult as far as the story goes, to give us more of an understanding of everyone rather than just Jeremiah.
Yeah. And the way that, they alluded to, the typical cult thing of like, we will ascend. But the like drugs that they were using, and like the bug, sting, and like all things like that. And even with like the bikers and the chemist, there were all these things that were alluded to, that it's like all these weird chemical things that they're using. It gave me like enough information, but then at times like especially the scene just with the chemist where he's the only one who talks, and I'm trying to figure out, I'm like, well, Red just like licked like whatever's in that jar, and he had like this like freak out moment, and then afterwards, like he's in this scene and it's a full conversation with him without him saying anything. Like that was the one scene that like really was standing out to me, of like, this is really extra weird, and I'm not sure I completely understand what's going on in this scene. I also really wish that we got to see the tiger like mess some people up. I thought that's what was going to happen. Like I thought Nicolas Cage was going to just like go in there and
Fight a
take
tiger.
everyone out with either fight a tiger or the tiger would like join up with him. Like I was like, oh, this is going to be sick. And then the tiger's just gone. And I was like, oh, all right.
And you never know what happens to it.
No,
You're just like, okay.
like where's my post credit of the tiger like off on his journey teasing the sequel.
Yeah, and because the cult members were on so many drugs, I couldn't figure out if Mandy was actually laughing at Jeremiah or if he just made that all up in his head and killed her for no reason.
At least the way I interpreted it is that she was actually laughing at him, but everything is so
Amplified.
Exactly. And so it was like that much more like intense laughter and everything, but she was probably just like these people are insane and this song that he's playing sucks.
And this dude is standing naked in front of me pretty much.
Yeah.
And I looked at the screen because I think at the time I checked something on my phone or something, and I looked up and I saw that scene and I was like, okay. Cult leaders are definitely weird. So it was certainly believable. And then at the same time, Mandy started laughing and I was like, well, there went his ego out the window.
Oh yeah. 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 And like he would shout, "Don't look at me," and it almost felt like he forcefully like was making them not look at him, and so it's like that's where it falls into the bit of a thin line of whatever they're taking or whatever they're doing. Is there some level of supernatural to this, or is this just so hyper visualized with the drugs that this is just how it looks to him? I'm assuming it's more of that it's like all these drugs and everything that they're taking, it's making him think that he has all this gifted power. But that was a wild scene in a long line of wild scenes. It's like I'm still like processing this whole movie. All I know is I've never been more excited than like sitting and watching a movie when you've got Nicolas Cage covered in blood, carrying a chainsaw, and another guy takes out a bigger chainsaw, and I'm like, oh my God, they're going to fight with chainsaws. Like, I just got so excited for that scene. And then they swing them up and the chainsaws smash together and there's just sparks flying everywhere. And I was like, yes, like this is what I signed up for.
Yeah, there's a moment too when Red goes into, it looks like a little apartment and there's the biker gang thing sitting on the couch, watching his porno on TV, and he ends up cutting his throat and all the blood spills out onto his face. Yeah. And I was like, that is so disgusting. But then all of a sudden his teeth are like bright white again later. And I know he went into the kitchen, so I didn't catch if he like rinsed the blood out of his mouth or something, or if that is just one of those funny little bloopers where his teeth are just filled with someone else's blood and then all of a sudden it's gone.
It's likely probably I didn't see any moment of cleaning his teeth, so it's likely just one of those movie things. That was wild. The kills in this were
brutal and insane. And they weren't easy either. None of them were really easy.
No.
Because even the one who is standing at the burning car at the end, and he shoots him and you can see the arrow being pulled out and you're like, okay, he's definitely going to be dead. And then he's not remotely dead at all. And you're just like, oh, okay. And it almost seemed like some of these characters were like something out of American Horror Story. There was a season where, they had the guy dressed in like the head to toe vinyl-y suit or something, and it was just the black stretchy suit. And that character in particular, the one that got shot with the arrow, reminded me of that one just because you couldn't really see any of the faces. And
I could definitely see that.
It definitely felt like something out of a season of American Horror Story. And I like that you could tell they put a lot of effort into the designs, but they were simple so that they would still look menacing in the dark.
Absolutely. The design work and the practical work of of everything was not just so well done, but I think, as you mentioned earlier, like it's so clear that this movie has such a very specific vision, style, and tone that it's going for, and it leans in like 110% on every single one of those pieces. It's like, we're gonna do a ton of crazy stuff with colors, amplify it. We're gonna do a ton of stuff with great practical effects. Not only are we gonna amplify it, but we're gonna put a crazy, weird, but super awesome macaroni and cheese commercial with a goblin in the middle of this movie. That was amazing. And it's like, here's this tiny thing that you never see even on the full screen that you're watching, but they made up a practical goblin puppet to do it. And and a goblin puppet that practically pukes macaroni and cheese on children. Like, just the fact that they just, every little thing, you could tell that that there's these people that they're making a genre film and they're having the absolute most fun doing it.
Yeah, another visual that really stood out was when he tossed the decapitated head of the lady who was kind of the leader of the ladies outside of Jeremiah. So it seemed like she was kind of, I don't know, maybe the first one Jeremiah recruited or something. Again, we don't get a ton of backstory on the cult members. They're kind of just there, and all end up dying except for, like I mentioned earlier, the girl. But when he tosses the head in and Jeremiah kind of freaks out when he realizes what it is, and you see that shot of it on the floor, it just looks so good even in the darker scenes. And a lot of times I'll notice that, especially in older stuff from, maybe the 70s, 80s, and 90s, they'll either make scenes really, really dark or really, really bright to sort of cover up the effects because they know they aren't as good. Like, I noticed that in the 1990 It miniseries when I watched that recently. There was a moment where the screen just got so bright you could hardly see anything. And even though this movie is so dark, it's not to hide the effects. I think it's just the fact that they're in the middle of nowhere in the woods. You're not going to have streetlights or anything. So it's just dark by nature, and it works for the subject matter.
Absolutely. Yeah. You can tell the high quality of effort that is into all of these effects. Like, I 100% agree. They're not trying to hide anything. They do so much to make that darkness unique, so that it isn't just, oh yeah, we're in the dark, it's in the woods. Like, the way it's juxtaposed with so much fire all the time, and obviously they burned Mandy in front of him, and the one guy, he kept saying that she still burns. So I feel like and this is what I'm like struggling with, like going through this podcast, is I'm like, all right, I just watched like a really unique and bonkers genre movie, and I thoroughly enjoyed every bit of it, and it was cool. I liked the characters, and it was tense, it was terrifying, it had everything. But then at the same time, I feel like with how weird it gets, that I still have so much time left that I need to process some metaphorical side of this movie, themes that they're introducing, that probably when I go back and look at maybe the behind the scenes special features, which shout out to Shudder for doing behind the scenes special features on their streaming service. Please, let's do that on other streaming services. But yeah, I'm just losing my mind thinking about this podcast, thinking about this movie. No, it was really cool.
Yeah, again, it was maybe a little too weird for me at times. Like, I could have done without that scene with Jeremiah just standing there with his robe wide open, and then maybe it wouldn't have been as effective. But I think just the fact that she started laughing at the song, you didn't necessarily need that visual to go with it. And it was one of those things where I was like, wow, they really went all in on the weird factor with this. And it's not to say that I didn't have a good time watching this movie. I did. It was just one of those things where going into it, I was like, okay, maybe this will be a little too weird for me. And ultimately, I had a good time with it, and it wasn't too terribly weird outside of the cult stuff. You have, these characters trying to live a semi-normal life out in the middle of the woods, which is not a thing I recognize that everyone wants to do, but for some people, that's their way of life. That's where they want to be. And the seclusion is something that they enjoy. And, as an only child, very familiar with that, but I still wouldn't want to go live out in the middle of the woods.
Yeah, no, there's no way I'd want to live in the middle of the woods, if only for the fact that the majority of movies I watch that people are living out in the middle of the woods, it never goes well. So, I know it's just movies, but why risk it? And then look back on, something bad happens if I'm living out in the middle of the woods, and I'm just going to sit there and be like, should have listened to all those movies I watched.
Yeah, another scene I want to talk about in particular is when the lady goes into the store where Mandy works. So I guess she does have something else to do other than her art, but clearly the shop has more normal hours than Red's job, because it's pretty dark out when he gets home. But again, woods, I don't know how sun works there. It seems to get darker faster in the woods because of all the trees and coverage that you have. But it seems like Mandy works in sort of this general store, I guess, which is probably more in town. And the lady comes up and just starts being so weird and asking all of these questions. And, you can tell Mandy thinks it's weird, but it doesn't seem to raise enough red flags. And I was like, you should be a little more concerned about this.
Yeah, absolutely. That was a really awkward and tense scene, because it's like they like with in a lot of sequences in this movie, they take their time and they just let that silence sit. And I kept questioning, like, is someone gonna pop up behind Mandy? Like, these are all the things that I'm waiting for. Like, I'm just like, is she just out there? Like, is this just reconnaissance to find her? And then assuming they follow her back to her home, or is she there and then they're gonna take her? That scene kept me guessing, because I wasn't sure exactly when it was going to happen. All we knew is that, the Jeremiah sent for Mandy. And so at any point in time, somebody's coming. And then even when they, did the musical whistle thing in the car to call upon the demon bikers, they let that space and time, just sit and stew, waiting in the car. And the kid just, oh my God, if he put that window up and down one more time, like I swear to God. Yeah. But it's like they did so much with sound in this movie, not just in the score, but with the balancing the silence with just very, very specific in the scene sounds, whether it's the creakiness of that window going up and down.
That drove everyone crazy.
Yeah. They did so many great ways to keep that atmosphere going in this movie. So yeah, it's definitely a weird movie, but sometimes I feel like you have a movie and it's like, oh, there's weird stuff in it, and it's like, oh, do these tones like really, really mesh? This movie definitely mixes genres, but I feel like it does it in a way that even if it can get a little too weird for some people and in some places, I feel like it knows what it wants to do, and it's naturally dipping in and out of all the different styles, which I was a little nervous about when I was watching it. I was like, oh, like how is all of this going to kind of mesh together? And even when just the only thing I knew about this movie was that the third act was insane. And so I was almost concerned, like, oh, is the third act going to feel jarring? And then it's just going to be one of those movies where people say, oh, the third act is awesome and crazy, but you just kind of have to get through the rest of it. And I'm like, well, I hope that's not how it is. But I felt like even the little bit that they gave us with their relationship to her death, and then to him getting his revenge. They kept it simplistic enough so that everything else around it could just build the meat and the bones of the rest of the film, because the main part of the story was so simplistic. But I do agree with you. Like I know the movie was already 2 hours, but I could have done with, you know, a 2.5 hour movie if I got maybe just a couple extra scenes to just figure out like who this cult is and like why they're doing what they're doing, and maybe some answers to the chemist stuff.
Yeah, when we first see Jeremiah, it sounds like he had seen Mandy somewhere before, and he was kind of like, I need that girl I saw. And
Yeah.
I was like, okay, you saw this girl once and you are being told by some higher spiritual person that you need to get this girl. And it was kind of unclear what was going on, but I am glad you brought up the sound, because I wanted to talk a little bit about the sound and the direction for this movie. So it was directed by Panos Cosmatos. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but
I think that's correct.
He's only really done a few things. He was a producer on a documentary, and then he directed a movie called Beyond the Black Rainbow in 2010. And that was the only other thing he had directed and written other than Mandy.
Yeah. And also apparently quite weird.
Yeah, just by looking at the cover or the poster for the movie, it looks like it is along these lines. And it'll be interesting to see if he ends up doing more stuff, because that's a pretty big gap, even for a director who might not direct as many things as actors would act in a given span of time. But you know, I think he had a very interesting vision for this and a very interesting way of going about it. But then you have the sound, and like you said, not just the soundtrack, but just the effects sounds and everything that amplify the tension in this movie tenfold easily. When that soundtrack came in too, I was like, oh my goodness, this is so tense. And unfortunately, the guy who worked on the soundtrack has since passed away, and it was actually fairly recent after the movie had been released. So, you know, that is super unfortunate. And you have these composers who just really know when to go all out. And I think Stranger Things is kind of the same way. The soundtrack really amplifies the experience with that show, and that's how I felt with this.
Definitely. Yeah, no, I mean, even the chapter like text and everything had that aesthetic that reminded me of Stranger Things, and you know, the synths and everything. And I'm obviously, I mean, styles like this have been used long before Stranger Things, but in recent years, these are two that I definitely feel like really capture that style in a soundtrack that, and in a score that it feels creative and new, and not just, oh, this is like 80s sounding for 80s sake. You know, they add a character to the score. And yeah, I remember around Oscar time, I forget why, but there was a reason that his score was not eligible for an Oscar, but just about anyone that I follow on Twitter that's, you know, heavily involved in like the big discussions of the Oscar discourse and everything like that, this score was so high on everybody's list of just basically like, this should win, but it's not eligible. So that for this movie that, you know, largely was just in festivals and I think a very limited theatrical run, and now lives on Shudder, you know, the score has far and wide, you know, reached the masses of people's fandom for it. So it's really unfortunate that, you know, he passed away. But it's nice to see that, you know, I guess the last thing that he likely worked on is so loved and appreciated.
Yeah, Mandy really feels like a movie that's going to have this sort of cult following, and, you know, no pun intended there, but it's something that happens with a lot of movies in the horror genre, unless they end up becoming sort of these prestige films like A Silence of the Lambs or even Get Out. And hopefully Us, because I enjoyed that. I know some people didn't like it as much as Get Out, but this was one of those movies where I feel like Nicolas Cage's performance and that combined with the soundtrack and everything just really amplified the experience of this movie. And even though I thought it was too weird for my liking at times, it was something that I could understand why people got so excited about this movie.
Definitely. Yeah, no, I feel like it's a really, for people who enjoy genre films and horror films and everything of the sort. I feel like this is a really great, enjoyable film for people to just watch and have a plethora of things to discuss about it. Like this is, I feel like this is a movie that even if you're kind of like, that was really weird, and I'm, maybe in some spots it's like, I'm not sure I get it, but I still, the movie made me want to go and recommend it to my friends and be like, you need to watch this. I don't know if you're going to like it, but you need to watch this so we can talk about it. And I feel like it's one I'm definitely going to be Googling a bunch to see what other people's thoughts are on it. I definitely want to check out the special features, to see a bit more of like the process. Maybe it'll illuminate some things. And it's very possible that I think this will be one that I even, revisit, because it definitely really intrigued me, and I had a good time with it. I was unnerved by it. I would go with, to quote the Cheddar Goblin, that the movie was goblin good.
What would that translate to in a rating out of 5?
For me, I think I'm somewhere between, I'm probably going to go lean towards a 4.
Okay.
Because I feel like as a movie of what it set out to do, I think it accomplished it. And I can't think of really many structural issues except for the, thinking of, trying to figure more out about the cult. But I don't know if they necessarily wanted us to know more about the cult, even if I personally want that. So it's definitely, it's somewhere between like a 3.5 and a 4. But it's not to any, even if it ends up being a 3.5 when I finally log it, like that's not a detriment to the movie at all. I hate ratings. They stress me out.
I know.
But I do them anyway. I sit
Same.
and I stress about them on Letterboxd and
Exactly. And, I'll link to both of our Letterboxd accounts in case anyone wants to follow us there.
Yeah.
But
you can see my final decision, whether it ended up a 3.5 or a 4, and feel free to yell at me about it if you disagree.
yeah, see, I was more in the 3 to 3.5 range and ultimately went with the 3 just because I don't know if it's because I was multitasking or the fact that I was maybe a little bored enough at the beginning to be multitasking in the first place.
That's fair.
And then it got a little weird in spots. And that's not to say I didn't enjoy the experience of watching this, because an experience is definitely what it is, whether you like it or not. And, I clearly fall right in the middle, which, a 3 out of 5 isn't a horrible rating. It just, for me, it means, I had a good time while watching this, but I probably won't revisit it anytime soon. Typically, it's the movies that I give a 4 or 5 to, or, 4.5, obviously, that I'm like, okay, I really had fun with this, or this was a perfect movie. I enjoyed it. I'll probably revisit those movies at some point. And I think that's fine, because I've been watching a lot of horror movies lately, and I found that there are some that a lot of my friends will love and be like, you need to watch this, you need to watch this. And then I watch it and I'm like, it was fine, and everyone is going to have their own preferences. And I am definitely glad that I watched it. So there is that at least. But Tim, do you have any final thoughts here before we wrap this up?
Not really. I mean, just that, like you said, it's, I've been watching a ton of horror movies all year, but obviously, especially we hit October and, really, amp it up on how much we watch and talk about horror movies. But that's the cool thing about this whole genre and movies like this and stuff on Shudder, is that this movie was absolutely an experience. And I think it's, for anyone a fan of genre movies, this is an experience worth having. Whether or not you watch it ever again, whether or not you enjoy it, you'll definitely have an experience. And I mean, and I think that's the coolest thing about all all this, is that the genre literally has some piece of style for everybody's interests, and it's always fun to check out what other people's recommendations are and see it's like what did they connect with this movie. So I know I'm going to be hopping onto Shudder probably after we finish recording to pick the next thing that I'm going to watch. And yeah, I mean, that's all I can say. This movie was an experience. I had a good time, and I definitely recommend it and recommend Shudder.
As do I. I've been making some good use of it this month already. And before we go, I quickly want to let you all know about our Patreon. You can support Welcome to Geekdom for either $1 a month or $5 a month. $1 will get you a thank you on the show, and $5 will allow you to pick a topic for me to cover with a guest, and I will get through whatever you choose as quickly as possible and get an episode done on it. You can also find us on Twitter at GeekdomPod and on Instagram at Welcome to Geekdom. Tim, thank you so much for coming on to talk about Mandy today.
Always a pleasure.
And to our listeners, as always, thank you all for listening, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.